All right, tomorrow, Ivanka Trump, former senior White House official, which is sort of still funny to say, an eldest daughter of Donald Trump, is expected to testify in the New York Attorney General's $250 million lawsuit against her daddy and the Trump Organization. She's going to have a tough act to follow after her father's preposterous performance on the stand yesterday, including one incident that led the judge to tell Trump's lawyer, quote, "I would beseech you to control him if you can. If you can't, I will. I will excuse him and draw every negative inference that I can. Do you understand that?" Now, there were also more substantive moments when Trump admitted he had signed a document making representations about his financial situation, quote, in order to induce lender to accept this guarantee and to enter into the credit agreement. MSNBC legal analyst Katie Phang points out that this, quote, a critical admission by Trump that he admits that the intent in making these financial representations was to convince lenders to loan money. But ultimately, I think we've reached a phase of this trial where it can best be compared to the infamous Chicago 7 trial in 1969, where the anti-war protesters on trial decided to turn the whole thing into a circus and, put the system on trial. Basically, the turn that Donald Trump and his attorneys have made here, even at the risk of enraging the judge who will be the lone one deciding Trump's culpability in this case. More importantly, every judge who has a Trump trial coming up should be watching this because it looks like a dress rehearsal to polarize opinion about the legitimacy of the proceedings themselves rather than try to win the case within the confines of the court. MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin was in the courtroom for yesterday's performance, and she joins me now.
Hey.
Does that scan to you that there is a tactical decision? There's different ways to look at this. One is, you can't restrain Trump and he doesn't have any self-control. I don't quite buy that. The other is, basically, this is the tactic now, is like trying to sort of bait the judge into saying something that they could use for appeal and trying to sort of convert this into kind of a polarized prism of like, this judge is out to get me, and that's really what they're up to.
I think it can be both. I think there are moments where Trump showed he can be disciplined, and partially he showed that when he started to echo things that I know his lawyers have told him, right? When he talked about what you can expect during the rest of this trial, which witnesses are going to come, which important bankers will be there, and which expert witnesses, or he tried to pull out of his pocket somewhat preposterously the language of the disclaimer statement that appeared on each of his statements of financial condition. He's clearly fluent in some of what's going on in this case, and yet I'm not sure that his explosions at the judge, at Kevin Wallace, who's a lawyer with the AG's office, or even at Tish James herself, were as calculated as people think.
That's interesting. Yeah, so they read more organic to you.
They felt more organic because the tone was so different. Chris, you and I have talked about before that as a watcher in the courtroom, when Trump goes out to the hallway and he gives those impromptu press conferences, for security reasons, those of us who are in the courtroom can't follow him out. We can't watch that. When I saw video of those press conferences yesterday, I saw a Trump who was remarkably more cool and collected in his tone, even if the content of what he was saying was vitriolic, than he was when he lost his cool towards Judge Engoron, towards Tish James, towards Kevin Wallace, when he was saying, these proceedings are a disgrace, you're a disgrace, you called me a fraud and you didn't even know me. All of that felt very personal and very impulsive.
Okay, so that's interesting. That feels like a person not making a tactical. This is not, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. I mean, this is someone who is actually struggling to control himself. I mean, there clearly is a kind of pathos here, which is that he's obsessed with being people thinking he has less money than he does, basically. And that I mean, I guess the Occam's razor way of viewing his approach to this is just that, it really stresses him out for people to think that he's poorer.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, at one point they were talking about whether his brand value was incorporated in his financial statements. He insisted that GAAP allows you to do that. Spoiler alert for our viewers, it does not. But at one point he said, my brand value got me elected president of the United States. So he is well aware that the value of the Trump brand is part of his lore. It's not only part of his lore as control over an empire, but as a political dynasty as well.
What do you think about how his performance was as a witness, independent of the histrionics, in terms of what it meant for what inferences on the facts that the fact finder in the case of Engoron can draw?
Oh my God, it was disastrous.
It was disastrous.
Absolutely, because
that's interesting.
One of the things that I keep trying to emphasize to folks is this isn't just the remedial phase of the trial. This is about 6 more counts that the Attorney General didn't ask for summary judgment or judgment before trial on, all of which necessitate proof of intent. On that, the Attorney General got lots of helpful admissions. He admitted he reviewed and approved financial statements and occasionally suggested changes. He agreed he was responsible for their fair presentation. He agreed he talked to Jeff McConney and Alan Weisselberg, the 2 top financial officials at the Trump Organization, about those. And he agreed at one point that he intended to forever forfeit the right to use Mar-a-Lago as anything but a private club. That actually is part of a legally binding covenant.
It's like a document.
Yes, and then in the next breath, he insisted, and I have the right to change that at any point in time. So it's like the rules do not apply. That same Trump ethos definitely translated into this proceeding, but he nonetheless made a number of really damaging admissions if you could see beyond the temper tantrums.
Do you think the judge does?
I think the judge absolutely does. And I think the judge is much more facile with and familiar with the documents than Trump himself is. And so, Trump's insistence, you won't let me read from this document, you're not letting me complete the record, that phrase, the disclaimer statement, is in every single one of the financial statements. That's part of the record already of the case.
God, exhausting. I'm exhausted on your and the judge's behalf listening to your recounting this. Better you than me.
I have no idea what to say to that.
Better
but thank
you
you
than me. I'm glad you're there for us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.